Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Eventually, the verity that had been stewing beneath times of guarded ganders, half-answers, and precisely constructed falsehoods erupted with quiet but unrecoverable force when Matt reached the emotional breaking point that had visited him his entire life, a moment that felt less like an explosion and more like a slow, suffocating collapse as every secret he carried began to crush him from the inside out, because Matt had always known that the story he was told about his parents no way completely added up. And living in Genoa City where patrimonies define identity and pedigrees shape fate's only stone that dubitation into a lifelong pang that refused to heal, especially every time he crossed paths with Jack Abbott or Diane Jenkins and felt a strange, inarguable pull that he could no way explain. A sense of recognition that went far beyond coexistence and crept into his dreams, his fears, and the questions he avoided asking indeed himself. And as the weight of the history grew heavier, Matt's jest had shifted in subtle but telling ways, marked by unforeseen recessions, unexplained wrathfulness, and an compulsive need to uncover old records, sealed lines, and forgotten sanitarium logs that everyone differently sounded eager to keep buried. Because nearly deep down he'd formerly accepted what his heart had been brooding for times, that his entire actuality was erected on a taradiddle precisely designed to cover two important people at the expenditure of one child who no way had a choice. And when the verity eventually surfaced, it didn't arrive with theatrics or crying, but with a calm, ruinous clarity that left no room for denial, as Matt laid bare the full extent of what he'd discovered, revealing that he wasn't the product of anonymous parents who faded into obscurity as he'd been told, but the result of a deeply complicated and designedly cancelled chapter in Jack and Diane's history, one born during a period of treason, fear, and ruthless damage control that reshaped multiple lives ever because times before, at the height of their volatility, when ambition, instability, and distrust ruled every decision, Diane had given birth in secretiveness, induced that exposure would destroy everything she had fought to make, while Jack, consumed by his own chaos and detracted by commercial wars and emotional snares, had been led to believe that the child was lost, a taradiddle that was easier to accept than the consequences of the verity. And so the decision was made, still efficiently and without compassion, to place the baby into another family, to abolish records, to change names, and to pretend that the child no way was, all in the name of survival, character, and control. Yet the irony of that decision visited every step of Matt's life, because despite the erasure, he was drawn back into the route of the very people who abandoned him, intentionally crossing paths with his natural parents again and again, seeing familiarity without understanding why, while Jack and Diane, each in their own way, were agonized by an implied guilt that manifested as guard, avoidance, and a nearly illogical interest in Matt's life whenever he appeared. And when Matt eventually confessed that he knew the verity, that he'd traced his origins through blood tests, falsified relinquishment papers, and long-buried medical lines, the disclosure landed with brutal perfection, stripping Jack of his authority and confidence in a moment and reducing Diane to a frozen silence that spoke louder than any denial ever could, because there was no escaping the data, no clever initiative left to emplace, no power play strong enough to undo what had formerly been done. And in that moment, Jack was forced to defy the horrifying reality that his heritage was deficient, that his moral certainty was erected on a foundation of poltroonery, and that the son he no way knew he'd spent time searching for verity alone, while Diane faced an indeed more ruinous reckoning as the layers of reinvention she had wrapped herself in over decades began to peel down, exposing the alarmed, calculating woman who formerly believed that love and fatherhood were luxuries she couldn't go. And the impact of Matt's concession gurgled far beyond that single battle, shaking the veritably core of the Abbott family and hanging to unravel alliances, commitment, and precisely curated narratives across Genoa City, because a secret of that magnitude no way exists in insulation. And as whispers began to spread, old adversaries took notice, old injuries restarted, and the consequences of Jack and Diane's choices started to surface in unanticipated ways, forcing Jack to question every decision he'd ever made in the name of family while realizing that the one family member who should have signified most was the bone he'd failed entirely. And for Matt, the concession wasn't an act of vengeance or atrocity but an act of emancipation, a hopeless attempt to reclaim his identity after a continuance of living in the murk of other people's falsehoods, because knowing the verity didn't bring him peace so much as it brought clarity, and clarity, while painful, was the first step toward mending. Yet mending would not come fluently or snappily, especially not in a megacity where remission is tentative, and love is frequently transactional. And as Jack stood paralyzed by the weight of his own silence and Diane grappled with the unrecoverable exposure of her history, the story shifted from shock to consequence, from disclosure to reckoning, as Matt's actuality came a living memorial that secrets don't stay buried ever, that the choices made in moments of fear echo across generations, and that no quantum of power, plutocrat, or manipulation can truly abolish the verity, leaving Jack and Diane speechless not because they demanded words, but because for the first time in their lives, there was nothing left they could say to justify what they had done. And as the occasion closed on the quiet desolation of 3 lives ever altered, the communication was unmistakable and hauntingly clear. Some admissions don't just change connections, they review heritage itself. The fate of Matt's concession didn't explode outward incontinently but rather spread through Genoa City like a slow-moving storm, heavy with pressure and expectation, because exposures of this magnitude infrequently resolve themselves in neat conclusions, and rather they loiter in the air, changing how people look at one another, altering commitment, and turning formerly stable foundations into fragile visions. And for Jack Abbott, the silence that followed Matt's verity came unsupportable, not because of public outrage or commercial consequences at first, but because of the private reckoning he could no longer overrun, as recollections he'd compartmented for decades began to resurface with cruel clarity, moments he formerly dismissed as confusion or manipulation now revealing themselves as deliberate avoidance, as he realized that nearly along the way he'd chosen convenience over responsibility, image over integrity, and ambition over motherhood, and the weight of that consummation followed him into every corner of his life, into Jabot boardrooms where his authority suddenly felt concave, into family gatherings where horselaugh chimed false, and into quiet moments alone where the question he could no longer suppress echoed relentlessly. How could a man who erected his conglomerate on heritage fail to fate his own blood? And Diane, meanwhile, set up herself trapped in a different kind of captivity, one not erected of guilt alone but of exposure, because her entire survival strategy had always depended on reinvention, on controlling perception and rewriting history, and Matt's actuality shattered that control fully, forcing her to defy the woman she had been before she learned how to manipulate issues, the youthful mama who believed fear was more important than love and who induced herself that immolation justified deception. Yet now that immolation stood before her as a overgrown man demanding recognition not through wrathfulness but through verity, and the absence of dialogue between them was more cautioning than battle ever could be, because silence left room for reflection, and reflection left no escape, and as days passed, it came clear that Matt's concession had shifted commodity abecedarian in the power dynamics of Genoa City, because secrets are currency in that city, and Matt suddenly held the most precious bone of all, a verity that intertwined 2 of its most influential numbers and hovered to destabilize entire family structures. And while some residers viewed Matt with dubitation, questioning his motives and wondering whether his timing was strategic, others saw him as a long overdue reckoning, a memorial that honored doesn't vindicate responsibility, and this division only boosted the emotional pressure girding him, because Matt himself wasn't seeking power or vengeance, but understanding, and that distinction signified, indeed if not everyone honored it incontinently, and as he navigated this new reality, Matt set up himself scuffling with the incongruity of identity, because knowing who his parents were didn't suddenly give him a sense of belonging, but rather fractured the identity he'd erected on independence and tone reliance, forcing him to defy uncomfortable questions about whether nature or nurture truly shaped him, whether the traits he despised in Jack and Diane were inherited or learned, and whether he could ever claim a heritage he no way acceded to inherit. And these questions counted heavily as he began to realize that the verity didn't simply grant him answers but demanded opinions about his future, his boundaries, and how important space Jack and Diane would enthrall in his life moving forward. And for Jack, that query was agonizing because for the first time, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative, not the one setting terms or negotiating issues, but a man staying to see whether his son would indeed allow him a place in his life, and that vulnerability exposed cracks in Jack's confidence that many had ever witnessed, as he began to rethink not only his history but his present, questioning whether his leadership style, his connections, and his moral compass had been shaped by a continuance of avoiding emotional responsibility, and Diane's reckoning unfolded else but no less sorrowfully, as she plotted with the consummation that her survival instincts had eventually bring her the one connection that might have predicated her, and that the polished, composed woman she presented to the world was erected on a foundation of loss she no way truly reused. And as Genoa City's social circles buzzed with enterprise and half-trueness, the counter-accusations of Matt's concession began to ripple outward, affecting not just Jack and Diane but the Abbott family as a whole, as siblings and abettors were forced to defy the possibility that their understanding of family history was deficient, and that fidelity to Jack might bear redefining one's judgments and unborn faithfulness. And this query created fractures within the family that couldn't be ignored, as old resentments resurfaced and new alliances formed grounded on who believed Matt, who misdoubted him, and who stressed what the verity might bring them tete-a-tete. And amid this shifting geography, Matt's presence came both a catalyst and a glass, reflecting the undetermined pressures that had long was beneath the face of Genoa City's polished facade, because his story exposed the uncomfortable reality that indeed the most important families are shaped by fear, secretiveness, and defective opinions. And as the days turned into weeks, the question of conciliation impended large, not as a guarantee but as a possibility fraught with conditions and consequences, because remission in Genoa City is infrequently unconditional, and for Matt, remission was ain't commodity he owed but commodity he might choose, if and when he believed that Jack and Diane had truly brazened the detriment they caused. And this imbalance of power where the child held the emotional authority over the parents marked a profound shift that neither Jack nor Diane could fluently accept, as it forced them to relinquish control and admit that some losses cannot be undone, only conceded. And as the plot continued to unfold, it came decreasingly clear that Matt's concession wasn't the end of the story but the morning of a far more complex chapter, one that would test the limits of redemption, review the meaning of family, and challenge the characters of Genoa City to defy the uncomfortable verity that the history is no way truly buried, only staying for the moment when someone stalwart enough decides to dig it up. And in that sense, Matt's concession did further than reveal a retired lineage. It forced an entire community to reckon with the consequences of silence, proving that verity, formerly spoken, has a way of reshaping everything it touches, leaving behind not destruction alone, but the possibility, still fragile, of commodity more honest taking its place. As time moved forward, the reality of Matt's concession began to settle into commodity heavier and further endless, no longer a shocking disclosure but a living verity that demanded adaptation from everyone it touched. And this shift proved far more delicate than the original impact, because shock fades snappily but consequence does not, and for Jack Abbott, consequence manifested as an corrosion of certainty in areas of his life he formerly believed unshakable, particularly his sense of moral authority, which had long served as the backbone of his leadership at Jabot and within his family, and now that authority felt compromised, not because others openly challenged him, but because he challenged himself, replaying opinions from decades past with a clarity he designedly avoided at the time, fading patterns of avoidance and tone, defense that extended far beyond Matt's birth and into nearly every major relationship he'd ever had. And this internal reckoning subtly altered his jest, making him more reticent, more reluctant, and less willing to dominate situations through force of personality alone, while those around him began to notice the shift, seeing that Jack Abbott, the man who always had a plan, was now navigating strange emotional home without a chart, and Diane meanwhile endured a different but inversely destabilizing metamorphosis, as the layers of countenance she had reckoned on for survival began to crack under the pressure of sustained tone examination, because once the verity was exposed, she could no longer categorize the pain of giving up her child as a necessary immolation, and rather had to defy it as a crack that had shaped her capacity for attachment, trust, and vulnerability ever ago. And this consummation forced her to rethink not only her once conduct but her present connections, questioning whether her instinct to control issues was a defense medium born of loss rather than ambition. And this soul-searching left her emotionally raw and changeable, creating pressure with those who anticipated the confident, strategic Diane they had always known, while Matt, caught between these two unraveling numbers, set up himself enwrapping a strange emotional space that oscillated between commission and insulation, because while the verity gave him agency, it also placed an enormous emotional burden on his shoulders, as he became the focal point for undetermined guilt, remorse, and craving that had been suppressed for decades. And this attention was inviting, especially given that his own mending was far from complete, and as he tried to reuse the counter-accusations of his lineage, Matt grappled with a deep sense of relegation, feeling neither completely separate from nor completely accepted by the Abbott world, because blood alone didn't grant belonging, and belonging couldn't be forced through obligation, and this nebulosity shaped his relations with the broader Genoa City community, as some saw him as an extension of Jack and Diane's influence, while others viewed him as a stranger exploiting a connection he no way asked for. And these clashing comprehensions created a terrain where Matt constantly felt scanned, judged not for his character but for his origin, buttressing the veritably sense of erasure he'd spent his life trying to overcome. And as weeks turned into months, the ripple goods of the concession extended into unanticipated corners of Genoa City, resurfacing old battles and reigniting dormant resentments, as those who had formerly been hurt by Jack or Diane began to reassess their own histories through the lens of this new verity, questioning whether their pain had been contributory damage in a pattern of tone preservation that constantly prioritized power over people. And this reevaluation led to subtle but significant shifts in alliances, as trust eroded and long-standing hypotheticals were challenged, creating a turnabout of insecurity that hovered to upend precisely maintained social scales. And amid this turbulence, Matt's part evolved from unresistant verity teller to reticent catalyst, as his bare presence forced others to defy questions they would rather avoid, about responsibility, remission, and the cost of silence. And this responsibility counted heavily on him, because while he'd chosen to reveal the verity, he hadn't chosen the consequences that followed. And this pressure reached a turning point when Matt began to realize that defining his future would bear further than admitting his history. It would bear purposeful boundaries, opinions about what he wanted rather than what others anticipated of him. And this consummation marked a quiet but profound shift in his character, as he began to assert his independence not through defiance but through clarity, refusing to be absorbed into narratives that didn't align with his values. And for Jack, witnessing this autonomy was both painful and humbling, because it underlined the times he'd lost and the reality that fatherhood couldn't be retroactively claimed through remorse alone, while Diane faced an inversely sobering verity, that redemption wasn't commodity she could orchestrate or accelerate, but commodity that might no way completely arrive, and that the most she could hope for was acknowledgement rather than forgiveness. And this acceptance forced her to defy the limitations of reinvention, understanding that some performances of herself couldn't be rewritten without defying the detriment they caused. And as the plot strengthened, it came clear that Matt's concession had permanently altered the emotional armature of Genoa City, introducing a new subcast of complexity to connections that formerly sounded straightforward, because it challenged the myth that power equates to control and that heritage can be curated without consequence, and rather revealed a more uncomfortable verity, that identity is shaped as important by what's hidden as by what's known, and that mending when it comes at each is infrequently neat or complete. And as the narrative moved forward, the question was no longer whether Jack and Diane could recover from the exposure of their secret, but whether they could evolve beyond it, whether they could learn to live in a reality where verity mandated the terms rather than fear, and whether Matt, having reclaimed his origin, could now claim a unborn, defined not by abandonment or disclosure, but by choice, leaving Genoa City ever changed by a concession that didn't end with answers, but with the enduring challenge of living actually in its fate. As the weight of everything continued to settle, the final phase of this reckoning unfolded not in dramatic competitions but in quiet consummations that proved just as important, because the true fate of Matt's concession wasn't measured by public response or rumored reproach, but by the subtle, unrecoverable shifts inside each person involved. As Jack began to understand that redemption would not arrive through grand gestures or explanations, but through harmonious restraint and respect for boundaries he'd no way learned to recognize ahead, while Diane came to accept that guilt couldn't abolish damage, only admit it, and that living with that knowledge would be an endless part of her identity rather than a temporary discipline. And for Matt, the verity eventually stopped feeling like an armament or a burden and rather came a foundation, amiss but solid, upon which he could begin erecting a life defined by intention rather than secretiveness, because knowing where he came from no longer mandated where he'd to go. And this quiet commission marked the true resolution of the concession, as Genoa City acclimated to a reality in which heritage was no longer unquestioned and power no longer insulated anyone from consequence, leaving behind a lasting memorial that verity doesn't always bring check, but it does bring clarity. And occasionally clarity is the only honest ending there can be.